Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself be carried backwards through the corridors of time. Imagine the Earth not as we know it, but as it was nearly 4 billion years ago, a world so young that it had only just settled into calm after its fiery, chaotic birth. No forests rose upon the horizon, no mountains stood tall, no rivers carved their way through valleys. Instead, there was only the ocean, endless and deep, stretching in every direction like a shimmering cloak wrapped tightly around the planet. These were the first true oceans, born of a cooling Earth. When the great seas condensed from steam and rain, they poured across the surface until they swallowed nearly everything. There were no continents yet, no broad plateaus to break the monotony of water. The surface of the world was a vast, restless mirror of the sky above. To stand upon it, even in imagination, is to be surrounded by infinity, the line between sea and sky blurred into something dreamlike, eternal. The waters themselves were not the clear blues we think of when we picture the sea. They were darker, heavier, thick with minerals leached from the newborn crust below. Iron dissolved in their depths gave them hues of greenish-black, glinting only when the young sun's light managed to pierce the haze of atmosphere. They were restless waters, forever stirred by wind, heated from below by the restless fire of the mantle, and struck from above by lightning that split the skies with white brilliance. If you floated upon those waves, you would feel the world's rawness. You would hear storms rolling across the horizon with a sound that was not broken by mountains or muffled by valleys. Thunder would boom over the sea, unbroken, echoing in a way that made the whole planet sound like a drum. Rain would lash down in endless sheets, for there was no land to anchor clouds, no mountains to block winds, no forests to drink the water. The storms simply swept on, their power unchecked. And yet in the spaces between tempests, there was serenity. Imagine the stillness of a world without birds, without insects, without the chatter of leaves or the chorus of frogs. There was only the sighing rhythm of waves and the faint hum of wind across the water. At night, when the clouds thinned, the sky revealed itself in breathtaking clarity. Stars glittered fiercely above, their light reflecting upon the dark sea. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, mirrored upon the ocean below so perfectly that it must have seemed as though the world was suspended between two galaxies, one above, one beneath. The sun itself was weaker than the one we know. It was a young star, burning at perhaps 70% of its modern strength, casting a paler light across the waters. And yet it was enough to keep the oceans liquid, enough to give warmth to a world learning patience. Its rays turned the horizon into shades of gold and rose, coloring the seas with fleeting beauty. The atmosphere, rich in methane and carbon dioxide, tinted the skies into hazy oranges and deeper blues. Beneath the waves, the story was just as wondrous. In the hidden depths, chemistry stirred restlessly. Molecules met, collided, bonded, and broke apart in endless dances. The oceans were cauldrons, stewing with potential, waiting for the improbable spark that would ignite life. It had not yet come, but every lightning strike, every volcanic vent on the seafloor, every ripple of heat and mineral was preparing the stage for it. To drift in those oceans would be to feel the immensity of silence and possibility. You would sense the youth of the earth in every breath of wind, every crash of a wave. You might even feel the planet's own heartbeat beneath you, the pulse of magma surging, the whisper of the mantle's heat beneath the crust. This was a world in waiting, a world unhurried. Time itself seemed slower, as if the earth was content to dream for a while before waking into the richness of life and land. The oceans stretched on, as far as the mind could imagine. Yet deep below, unseen, the story of change was already beginning. In the fiery heart of the mantle, pressure and heat were working, lifting fragments of crust, welding them together, shaping something that would one day rise above these waters. It was not yet visible. It was not yet ready. For now, the seas ruled all. The earth belonged to them entirely. And so the first chapter of continents begins not with land, but with absence, with the endless oceans before land, with water and sky and fire hidden below, with a world so empty of features and yet so full of promise. For in that emptiness, in that quiet, lay the seed of the first continent, the promise of stone waiting to rise. The oceans ruled the earth, endless and unbroken, but deep beneath their surface, another drama was quietly unfolding. The mantle, vast and restless, was never still. It churned with currents of molten rock, rising and falling in slow, powerful motions, as if the planet itself was breathing. From these currents, heat surged upward, cracking the thin skin of the young Earth and sending fire spilling into the oceans above. In those moments, the first crust of the Earth was born, not the sturdy continents we know today, but fragile rafts of stone, islands of hardened lava that floated upon the mantle's shifting seas. They were young, unstable, and often short-lived. Some were shattered by eruptions, others were dragged back beneath the waters, swallowed by fire as quickly as they had appeared. Yet with every cycle of destruction, more fragments formed, each a little stronger, a little more enduring than the last. Picture the scene. The surface of the Archean Ocean shivers, trembling as magma surges upward. A plume of molten rock punches through, glowing red and gold, its heat sending steam roaring skyward in columns. As the lava pours into the water, it hardens with a hiss, blackening into volcanic rock. Cracks spread across its surface, releasing bursts of white vapor that rise into the haze-filled skies. Slowly, a newborn crust spreads outward, cooling into a jagged, uneven plateau beneath the waves. It is raw, alien, and utterly silent, save for the hiss of steam and the deep rumble of the mantle below. If you could stand there, upon this first crust, you would feel its tremors through the soles of your feet, the restless heartbeat of a planet still shaping itself. Around you, the ocean would boil and surge, waves thrashing against the glowing rock, carrying away fragments of blackened stone into the depths. The crust was thin, almost fragile. Beneath it, molten rock still pressed upward, seeking release. Fissures opened, spilling more fire into the sea. Pillars of lava rose and cooled into strange, twisting shapes, only to crumble again. Yet despite the chaos, this was the beginning of endurance. Piece by piece, layer by layer, Earth was learning how to build a foundation that could last. Over time, some of these volcanic rafts grew large enough to push upward, lifting portions of crust closer to the surface. They did not yet rise above the waves, but they hinted at what was to come. The first whispers of continents were there, hidden in the deep, waiting for their chance to break through. The oceans, for their part, embraced this newborn crust. Rainfall, heavy and unceasing, poured onto the fresh stone, carrying minerals into the sea. Lightning struck the hot surfaces, sparking reactions in the pools that formed within cracks and hollows. Steam filled the skies, mingling with the haze of methane and carbon dioxide, cloaking the Earth in a veil of mystery. Imagine drifting near one of these newborn formations, the air thick with mist, the water trembling with the force of eruptions. The sea is alive with sound, the crash of waves, the hiss of steam, the crack of lightning. It is chaotic, overwhelming, yet beneath that chaos lies a quiet promise that something enduring is beginning to take shape. The first crust was fragile, yes, but not meaningless. Each fragment carried the memory of fire and the patience of stone. Each piece laid a foundation upon which future land would be built. Though most of these early rafts would never survive, some would become the seeds of continents, the ancient cratons still buried within Earth's heart today. The planet was experimenting, as if sculpting with clumsy hands, raising, breaking, reshaping over and over again. And in that experimentation, something miraculous was happening. Earth was learning how to hold land above its seas. The world remained, for now, a realm of oceans. The waves still stretched endlessly, the stars still mirrored themselves upon the water at night. But deep beneath the surface, the foundation was being laid. The first crust had risen, the first stone had spoken. And though it was fragile, though it was fleeting, it was enough to signal that the age of continents was drawing near. The oceans stretched endlessly, calm and timeless from afar, yet within their depths the Earth was never still. The mantle moved restlessly beneath the crust, surging with fire, pressing against the fragile skin of stone. And when the pressure grew too great, the Earth broke open. From the cracks, fire was born. Volcanoes erupted through the waters with thunderous force, their voices echoing across the Archean seas. Jets of molten rock shot upward in plumes of red and gold, hissing as they touched the ocean's cool embrace. Steam billowed into the sky, rising in towering columns that turned the air white and heavy. For hours, sometimes days, the eruptions raged, pouring rivers of lava into the sea. Slowly through this violence, the first islands began to appear. At first, they were nothing more than blackened humps of stone, slick and steaming, surrounded by boiling waves. Their surfaces cracked as they cooled, splitting into jagged ridges and sharp cliffs. The air above them shimmered with heat, carrying the scent of sulfur, acrid and raw. These were not gentle lands. To stand upon one of these early islands, if one could, would be to stand upon fire itself. The ground would tremble beneath your feet, alive with the heartbeat of magma surging below. Fissures would split without warning, spilling red rivers that glowed against the darkness of cooling stone. The ocean roared endlessly at the edges, waves striking the newborn shores with relentless force, tearing at the rock even as it formed. And yet, for all their violence, these islands were fragile. Many did not last. Some were too small, too thin, and they were swallowed by the waves within days, broken back into fragments, dragged beneath the surface once more. Others collapsed inward, crumbling into the seas from which they rose. They were fleeting sparks of stone against the vast, eternal waters. But some endured. Layer by layer, eruption after eruption, they grew stronger, rising higher above the waves. Each new outpouring of lava hardened into basalt, building foundations deep into the ocean floor. With time, an island might grow large enough to stand firm against the sea. Its peaks would rise into the mist, jagged and dark, crowned with steam. Rain would fall upon it, hissing as it touched the hot rock, carving rivulets that wound downward into the ocean. Imagine the sight, a chain of volcanic islands scattered across the Archean seas, each one glowing faintly at night, their summits crowned with fire. Ash plumes stretched high into the sky, tinting the horizon in shades of gray and crimson. By day, the clouds above were heavy with rain, thunder rolling endlessly, lightning flashing across skies already darkened by volcanic haze. The Earth's young face was a canvas of fire and water, painted in contrasts both fierce and fragile. Though lifeless still, these islands hinted at what was to come. They were the first hints of permanence, the first bold attempts of Earth to hold land above the seas. In their cracks and tide pools, chemical reactions simmered quietly, stirred by heat and lightning. They became laboratories of possibility, places where stone, water, and sky could mingle in ways new to the planet. Over millions of years, these volcanic islands rose and fell in a rhythm as steady as the tides. Some drifted together, colliding, merging into larger fragments. Others stood alone, solitary sentinels in the endless sea. Together, they marked a turning point. For the first time, the world had more than the ocean. It had places that could be called land, however fleeting, however raw. And so the Earth, once only water and sky, now carried fiery jewels upon its surface, burning, steaming, cracking and trembling, but stubbornly holding their place. They were the islands of fire, and though most would crumble back into the sea, a few would survive, growing stronger, preparing the way for something greater. The first continent was still far in the future, but here, in these scattered volcanic arcs, the story of land had begun. Beneath the oceans, beneath even the fragile crust and fiery islands, the Earth's true heart stirred ceaselessly. The mantle, a vast ocean of molten rock, churned with slow, unrelenting currents. It was not quiet, nor was it still. It moved with the patience of 1 billion years, a rhythm too deep for human senses to follow. And in that rhythm lay the restless spirit of the planet itself. Imagine the mantle as a sea of stone, flowing so slowly that it seemed solid, yet alive with energy. Columns of heat rose upward in plumes, while cooler, denser stone sank downward again, a cycle as steady as breath. Where the plumes struck the crust, the surface cracked, splitting apart to release lava in fiery fountains. Where slabs of crust sank into the depths, they vanished into silence, swallowed by fire and pressure. It was a cycle of creation and destruction, endless and tireless. The crust above might have seemed fragile and temporary, but below, the mantle worked with certainty, shaping the destiny of the Earth. At times, the plumes surged upward with such force that entire fields of volcanoes awakened at once. The oceans boiled with their fury, steam rising into the sky in white towers, darkening the horizon. Ash fell like snow, mixing with the rain, drifting across the waters in veils of gray. For days, weeks, sometimes months, the Earth's voice roared in fire. And then, as though sighing, it would grow quiet again, letting the seas wash over its wounds. But the silence was never complete. Even in the calm, the crust trembled faintly, quivering with the deep murmur of the mantle. If you had stood upon one of those volcanic islands, you would have felt it beneath your feet, a subtle, constant motion, as though the ground itself was alive. This restlessness was not without purpose. Through it, the planet tested the strength of its crust. Through it, the earth learned how to knit together fragments of land, how to shape stone into something more enduring. The mantle plumes were like hands, lifting, breaking, pressing, and welding, sculpting the surface with infinite patience. From above, the oceans bore witness to these changes. Waves rolled endlessly across the waters, carrying fragments of rock torn from eruptions. Rain fell, mingling with ash, forming rivers that carved shallow gullies into the newborn stone. The atmosphere itself bore the mark of the Earth's restlessness, its colors painted by volcanic gases, its clouds thick with storms. And yet, for all its violence, there was a rhythm to this restlessness, a kind of balance. The Earth was not chaotic for the sake of chaos, it was working towards something. In the collision of islands, in the welding of crust, in the ceaseless churn of the mantle, the foundations of the first continent were being laid. Picture it now, deep below the sea, a plume of molten rock rises, glowing bright the closer it comes to the surface. It presses upward, cracks forming in the crust above, fire spilling out into the ocean. The sea roils, boiling and steaming as lava spreads outward, hardening into black stone. Nearby, another plume rises, another island forms. Slowly, across millions of years, these fragments drift toward each other, drawn together by forces unseen. They collide, merge, and grow. The Earth was restless because it was alive. Its motions were not random, they were the slow, patient weaving of a planet learning how to hold land. This restlessness, though violent to witness, was creative at its core. It was the heartbeat of a world preparing to lift its first continent into the light. And so the Archean Earth trembled and roared, sighed and whispered, moving always, never at rest. Its fires burned beneath the oceans, its crust cracked and healed, its mantle surged in endless cycles. It was a planet dreaming in stone, restless because it was becoming. The Earth was restless, yes, but even restlessness has pauses. After the fury of fire and the roar of molten rock breaking through the sea, there would come intervals of silence. They were not long in the measure of geologic time, but they lingered long enough for the world to breathe. Picture the aftermath of an eruption. The sea is still steaming, a white haze curling above the blackened rock, but the fountains of lava have stilled. The sky, heavy with clouds only hours before, begins to clear. The rolling thunder has softened into the distance, and lightning no longer arcs from horizon to horizon. The waves still lap at the new stone, hissing gently as they cool its edges, but even they seem quieter now, subdued by the weight of calm. The quiet feels immense, almost overwhelming. Without birds to sing or forests to rustle, the world lies in profound stillness. Only the ocean breathes, its rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, and in this pause, the earth feels vast, infinite, eternal. Mist drapes itself across the horizon, born of steam rising from countless fissures and pools. It blurs the line between sea and sky, making it difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The sun filters through faintly, its rays soften, diffused, as though the world has been wrapped in a silken veil. In this hazy light, the newly formed islands appear ghost-like, their outlines softened, their sharp volcanic ridges hidden beneath the shroud of mist. Rain falls, gentle this time, not the torrential storms that often accompanied eruptions. Droplets strike the warm rock, sizzle, and vanish into faint wisps of steam. They gather in shallow cracks and hollows, forming the first quiet pools on the surface of stone. These pools ripple with each raindrop, tiny worlds reflecting the gray sky above. Within them, minerals dissolve, mingle, and swirl, stirred by nothing more than patience. Though no life yet walks upon this land, these pools hum silently with possibility. The quiet is not empty, it is alive with subtle motion. The ocean swells softly, rising and falling with the pull of the moon, which at this time circled the earth much closer than it does today. The tides are stronger, wilder, and yet in this moment of calm, they feel like a slow breath drawn across the planet's skin. The wind too is gentle, brushing across the surface of the seas, carrying the faint scent of salt and sulfur. It whispers against the cooling stone, weaving between ridges and flowing into hollows, as though testing the new shapes of the earth. In these pauses, the world seems almost tender. The violence of fire is forgotten for a time. Instead, the earth shows its softer face, the sheen of rain on black rock, the silver shimmer of starlight on calm seas, the muffled quiet of mist that holds the world in its embrace. If you were to drift upon these waters in such a moment, you would feel as though you had entered a dream. The silence would be so complete, so absolute, that you might hear the faint trickle of water sliding down stone or the distant sigh of a wave breaking against a cliff. Each sound would carry with it the weight of eternity, stretching out into the endless stillness. The quiet between eruptions did not last forever. The mantle still moved beneath, still whispered with pressure and heat, and soon enough the earth would roar again. Fire would split the crust, and the seas would boil with fury. But these intervals of calm mattered. They were the world's chance to gather itself, to let new stone settle, to let rainwater carve its first delicate patterns, to let silence teach the planet how to rest. And so, between every outburst of violence, there was peace. Between every roar, a sigh. Between fire and fury, moments of stillness that wrapped the earth in mist and quiet. These pauses were part of the rhythm, just as essential as the eruptions themselves. For even a restless earth must learn to rest, if only for a while. The volcanic islands that rose and fell across the Archean seas were fierce, but they were fragile. Their foundations were basalt, dark, heavy stone born from fire, strong in the moment, but quick to break and crumble beneath the endless weight of waves and the restless pull of the mantle below. If Earth was ever to build something lasting, something that could endure the patience of billions of years, it needed a different kind of stone. And so, deep within the planet, another experiment began. Granite was unlike basalt. Where basalt was heavy and quick to sink, granite was lighter, more buoyant, able to float upon the mantle like wood upon water. It was born not of quick eruptions, but of slower, deeper processes, melting and mixing, pressure and heat working together with the patience of ages. Beneath the young crust, pockets of molten rock lingered, cooling more slowly than the fiery flows of volcanoes. From these slower crucibles came granite, speckled with crystals, shimmering faintly when touched by the sun. Imagine the first shards of granite rising into the world. At first, they were small, tiny patches of rock hidden among the basaltic fields. To the eye, they may have seemed unremarkable, but they were different, sturdier, destined to last. Each shard was like a seed, carrying the possibility of something greater. Over time, these patches grew, colliding with others, merging into larger masses. Where basalt crumbled and sank, granite endured, rising higher, surviving longer. The seas lapped against these new surfaces, waves breaking gently along their edges. Rain fell upon them, carving delicate grooves into the stone. Lightning struck their surfaces, sparking tiny reactions in pools that formed within their cracks. Slowly, these shards became havens of stability in a world otherwise restless. They were small, yes, but they were the beginning of permanence. The Earth was learning. With each eruption, each collapse, each new shard of granite, the planet experimented with endurance. The mantle pressed upward, lifting fragments of crust, while collisions between volcanic arcs welded pieces together. Sometimes the granite survived these collisions, sometimes it shattered, but each attempt left behind new pieces of the puzzle. Over millions of years, a mosaic began to form, a scattered quilt of granite patches floating upon the seas. Picture it now, scattered across the vast oceans, islands of fire still erupt and vanish, but here and there, something different gleams in the mist. A shard of granite, pale against the black basalt, rises quietly from the water. It does not glow with fire, nor does it roar with eruption. Instead, it stands silent, patient, enduring, its crystals catching the faint Archean sunlight. At night, starlight would have danced across these shards, their pale surfaces reflecting faint silver gleams, tiny beacons in the endless sea. To drift near one would have been to sense something different in the air, a stillness, a weight, as though the earth itself was beginning to settle into strength. Granite was not just stone, it was memory. It carried within it the patience of slow cooling, the endurance of resistance, the promise of land that could stand against both wave and time. These shards, scattered though they were the ancestors of every continent that would ever rise. The world did not yet know it, but the blueprint of the continents was already written in these fragments. For one day, they would collide, weld, and gather into something larger. One day, they would rise above the seas as the first continent, a true and lasting home for life. But for now, they were only shards, small, scattered, humble beginnings upon the endless ocean. And yet, in their silence, they carried the weight of the future. The ocean seemed endless, their waves stretching far beyond the horizon, but hidden below their restless surface, another drama unfolded. The Earth's crust, though fragile, was never fixed. It drifted, shifted, and collided, carried along by the patient currents of the mantle. Islands and fragments of granite moved slowly across the seas, and when they met, they did not simply pass one another by, they collided. Imagine the scene, not in moments or days, but in millions of years. Fragments of land, born of fire and hardened by time, drift upon the mantle like rafts upon a deep current. At first, the distances between them are vast. Hundreds of kilometers of ocean stretch between each shard. But slowly, too slowly for any living eye to see, they draw closer. One fragment moves with an almost imperceptible nudge. Another shifts in the opposite direction, until finally, across the expanse of deep water, they converge. When they meet, it is not gentle. The collision shakes the seafloor, sending tremors rippling outward like distant thunder. The edges of rock grind against one another, folding and breaking. Lava, pressed upward by the strain, spills through the cracks, weaving molten seams between the fragments. The ocean above roils with the disturbance, waves thrashing against the newborn edges of land. These collisions built more than chaos. They were acts of creation. With each impact, pieces of crust were welded together, their fractures sealed by molten fire. Where once there had been only scattered shards, now larger fragments began to emerge, sturdier, heavier, capable of resisting the relentless pull of the mantle below. Picture a chain of volcanic islands colliding with a pale shard of granite. The black basalt crashes against the lighter stone, shattering at its edges. But instead of sinking, the two fuse, bound together by eruptions that spew molten rock like glowing stitches across their seams. Over time, the jagged scars smooth, and what was once two becomes one. Above, the surface changes as well. Where once the sea had swallowed islands as quickly as they rose, now larger masses of land begin to endure. Their silhouettes grow against the horizon, jagged ridges, volcanic peaks, and rocky plateaus rising from the ocean, standing firm against the endless waves. The air above them shimmers with heat, the skies darkened by plumes of smoke, but still they remain. Between collisions, the world falls into long stretches of silence. The seas drift lazily around the newborn fragments, mist curling above their edges, rainwater pooling in their cracks. Minerals wash into the tide pools, where they mingle and react, stirred by lightning from storm-heavy skies. These quiet intervals become laboratories of chance, places where chemistry dreams of life, while the rocks themselves rest in the brief calm before the next upheaval. But the collisions always return. Slowly, steadily, the drifting fragments find each other again and again, their meetings violent yet creative. Each impact leaves behind a slightly larger piece of crust, a slightly stronger foundation. And so, across countless millennia, the Earth stitches itself together, weaving islands and shards into the beginnings of something vast. If you could see it from above, the Archean seas would no longer look as empty. Yes, the oceans still dominated, but scattered across their surface were scars of fire and stone, chains of islands, rafts of granite, clusters of fused land that hinted at the promise of a continent. To drift upon those waters was to witness the slowest and grandest of dances, a choreography written in fire and stone, performed on a stage as wide as the planet itself. These were the collisions in the deep, unseen by eyes, but monumental in their consequence. Each one brought the Earth closer to a new chapter, closer to lifting its first true continent into the light of the Archean sun. The Archean seas had watched patiently as fragments of crust collided, merging through fire and time. With each collision, the Earth's surface grew more complex. It was no longer just scattered rafts and volcanic islands. It was becoming something heavier, thicker, and stronger. And from this gathering strength, the first mountains were born. They were not mountains as we know them now. They lacked forests to cloak their slopes, rivers to carve their valleys, snow to crown their peaks. But still, they rose, jagged and raw, lifted from the ocean by the grinding weight of the colliding crust. For the first time, the surface of Earth reached skyward in lines and ridges, not just solitary peaks. The world of endless seas was broken by stone spines that pierced the horizon. Imagine it slowly, two fragments of crust, driven together over millions of years, meet in a violent embrace. Their edges buckle, fold, and thrust upward. Rock is pushed higher and higher, lifted by the unstoppable force of tectonics. Lava seeps through fractures, welding the folds together, glowing red in the darkness before cooling into veins of black stone. Layer upon layer, the pressure builds until the seafloor itself is wrinkled into ridges that rise above the waves. From afar, you would see new silhouettes forming against the hazy sky. Not islands, not low humps of volcanic stone, but jagged chains stretching for hundreds of kilometers. They gleamed dark under the Archean sun, steam rising from their fissures, clouds gathering above their peaks. Waves crashed against their bases, but they did not crumble. They were too vast, too heavy, too firmly anchored in the Earth's restless heart. The air around them was different. Winds swirled faster here, diverted by the rising ridges. Storms gathered against their slopes, releasing torrents of rain that washed across the bare stone. Water, in its endless patience, began to carve the surfaces, filling hollows, etching gullies, smoothing edges. In these mountains, the first landscapes were born, rough and empty, but landscapes nonetheless. At night, the stars crowned their peaks. Starlight gleamed upon sharp ridges, silver against black, casting long shadows into valleys below. The moon, closer to Earth then than it is today, hung enormous in the sky, pulling tides that surged violently against the mountains' bases. Its pale glow shimmered on wet stone, making the mountains appear ghostly, as though they had risen from a dream. To drift near their shores would have been awe-inspiring. Imagine sitting in a small inlet, the air thick with mist, the sound of waves echoing against sheer cliffs. The mountains tower above you, their slopes raw and broken, streaked with volcanic glass and new granite veins. Steam hisses from vents in their sides, carrying the scent of sulfur into the damp air. Rainwater pours down in streams, collecting into rivulets that tumble into the sea. Everything feels vast, new, and full of promise. These were the first mountain chains, Earth's bold declaration that it was ready to shape land on a grand scale. They were unstable at first, prone to collapse, their peaks torn away by erosion and volcanic fury. But even so, they endured. They showed that stone could rise and remain, that the planet could sculpt forms as dramatic and enduring as any sea. Over millions of years, more ridges followed, some merging into plateaus, others standing alone as broken arcs. Together, they stitched a new pattern into the Earth's surface, one that would echo through time. For though these mountains would eventually crumble, their roots remained. Buried deep in the crust, they formed the foundation upon which future continents would grow. In the stillness between storms, you might imagine standing at their base, looking upward. The sky seems closer here, the air cooler and sharper. Clouds swirl around the peaks, catching the last rays of the Archean sun. The mountains hum faintly beneath your feet, alive with the slow heartbeat of the mantle below. And in that hum, you feel the truth. Earth is no longer only a world of water. It is becoming a world of land and stone. The oceans remain vast, but they no longer reign unchallenged. The first chains of mountains stand tall, silent witnesses to a planet learning its strength, reaching skyward for the very first time. The mountains had risen from the oceans in jagged lines, sharp and raw, their edges split by fire, their peaks crowned with mist. They stood as bold declarations of Earth's strength, monuments to the restless collisions of stone. But even the strongest of creations cannot escape the patience of time. Time, after all, is the gentlest and most relentless of sculptors. Rain was the first hand of time. Clouds gathered above the mountains, heavy with Archean moisture, and released their endless burden. Droplets struck the bare rock, hissing faintly where they met still warm stone, running downward in threads and rivulets. At first, the water seemed harmless, a passing sheen upon black surfaces. But day after day, century after century, the rains fell without end. They pooled in cracks, seeped into fissures, froze and expanded in cycles unknown to us, but felt in stone. Slowly, patiently, they pried the rock apart. The mountains did not fall in grand collapses. They surrendered in whispers, tiny flakes of mineral washed away, grains carried into streams, fragments tumbled down slopes by quiet persistence. What had once been jagged began to soften. Sharp ridges turned to rounded forms. Valleys deepened, etched by rivers of rain. The stone did not resist. It simply yielded, grain by grain, to the patience of water. Wind, too, became a companion to time. Though the air was different then, thicker with carbon dioxide, tinted in hues of haze, it carried its own quiet force. It slipped across peaks, whistling through gaps and hollows, carrying with it fine dust torn from higher ridges. Over millennia, the wind wore the stone smooth, polishing surfaces, carving channels where it pressed hardest. Together, water and wind conspired in silence, their partnership unhurried, their work inevitable. Imagine standing upon a slope of these ancient mountains. The ground beneath your feet is rough, broken by cracks that glisten with pools of rainwater. Around you, streams cascade downward, trickling into deeper valleys. The air carries a cool dampness, tinged faintly with the metallic scent of minerals leached from the stone. Mist drapes itself across the ridges, softening their outlines, making them seem older than they are. You can hear the world breathing in quiet rhythms, the fall of water, the sigh of wind, the distant crash of waves at the base of cliffs. Over millions of years, these small acts accumulate. Rivers carve deeper channels, carrying sediments into the seas. The sharpness of the mountains dulls, their slopes broadening, their peaks collapsing into rubble. Yet this is not destruction, it is transformation. The mountains, once defiant and jagged, are learning the language of endurance. They are being shaped not by fire alone, but by the patience of elements, by the gentle hand of time. The oceans, too, play their part. Tides, pulled by a moon closer than ours, rise higher against the bases of cliffs. Waves pound against stone with tireless persistence, undermining edges, tumbling boulders into the surf. Each crash breaks away fragments, carrying them into the deep. Slowly, the mountains recede, their outlines softened by the embrace of the sea. And yet, even as they wear down, their essence remains. Their roots, buried deep in the crust, are immovable, untouched by rain or wind. These roots form the seeds of cratons, the ancient cores of continents that will endure for billions of years. Though the peaks crumble, though the ridges fall, the heart of the mountains remains, a foundation upon which the future will rise. The weight of time is not cruel, though it is unyielding. It reshapes, it softens, it transforms. In the Archean silence, the newborn mountains learn to bow to its patience. Their grandeur is not lost, but refined. They become landscapes, places where water flows, where valleys form, where the earth begins to resemble the patterns we know today. And so the mountains stood beneath the endless rains, their forms changing slowly, endlessly, under the weight of time. What was once raw and jagged became softened and worn, what was once violent became gentle. In their silence, the first landscapes of Earth were carved, not in fire, but in patience. For millions of years, the surface of the Earth had been a patchwork of fragments. Volcanic islands rose and fell, arcs collided, mountains lifted only to be worn away by rain and tide. Granite shards, lighter and stronger than their basaltic kin, floated stubbornly upon the mantle, refusing to sink. They were scattered across the seas like broken pieces of a vast puzzle. But the Earth was not content with scattering. Slowly, through the patient movement of tectonic currents, it began to gather. Deep beneath the oceans, the mantle continued its restless cycles, plumes rising, slabs sinking, currents tugging at the floating fragments. Granite rafts drifted, sometimes alone, sometimes chained together by volcanic arcs. The distances were immense, the movements imperceptible in a human sense, but over millions upon millions of years, the fragments inched toward one another. When they met, the world changed. Collisions were never gentle. The edges of granite slabs ground together, sending tremors rippling outward through the seas. The weight of impact forced some fragments downward, but others were thrust upward, welded together by molten seams. Magma poured into the cracks, fusing them into single, larger masses. What had once been scattered and fragile became heavier, stronger, more enduring. Picture it, a mosaic of islands, arcs, and mountain roots slowly converging. First, two pieces meet, fusing into one. Then another joins, and another, until across hundreds of kilometers, the waters are broken not by isolated shards, but by broad stretches of connected stone. Waves crash against their edges, rain falls upon their surfaces, rivers begin to trickle down their slopes. For the first time, Earth is learning the shape of a true landmass. The seas responded with new rhythms. Currents shifted around the growing masses, swirling into eddies along their edges. Storms broke differently, their winds split by rising ridges and highlands. Clouds gathered more thickly above the land, releasing rains that pooled in valleys and hollows. With each collision, the climate of Earth shifted slightly, shaped by the presence of land, where once there had been only water. Life, tiny, microbial, clinging to shorelines and tide pools, found new homes in the cracks of these gathered lands. Mats of cyanobacteria spread across wet stone, shimmering faintly under the Archean sun. Pigments stained the edges of pools green and purple, turning lifeless rock into canvases of color. In these places, chemistry danced more boldly, encouraged by the stability of stone that endured against the waves. At night, under skies crowded with stars, the gathered land seemed to glow with quiet strength. Their granite surfaces reflected moonlight, pale silver against the dark seas. The moon itself, looming larger in the Archean sky, pulled tides against their shores with restless force. Waves surged higher, carving at cliffs, but the land held. For the first time, something resisted the eternal embrace of the sea. This was not yet a continent, not fully. It was still fragmented, still growing, still vulnerable to the mantle's restless stirrings. But it was the beginning of one, a cradle of stone large enough to endure, heavy enough to shape the world around it. The gathering of lands was not quick. It took tens of millions of years, perhaps hundreds, each collision adding another piece to the puzzle. But with every addition, the earth grew more stable, more balanced between ocean and stone. What had once been an endless water world was becoming something more complex, more familiar, more like the home we would one day inherit. And so, in silence and fire, through collisions unseen, the first continent began to take shape. Not yet named, not yet vast, but real. It stood as proof that the earth was learning endurance, that out of chaos and scattering could come unity, strength, and permanence. The oceans still ruled, but their reign was no longer absolute. The land had begun to gather, and with it, a new age had dawned. For so long, the surface of Earth had been restless. Islands rose and fell, arcs collided and split, mountains lifted only to crumble again. It was a world of impermanence, a planet of fragments and fire. But now, slowly, a new rhythm was emerging, a rhythm of endurance. The collisions of granite shards and volcanic arcs had given birth to something larger than any single island. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, the Earth had been gathering its strength. And at last, after millions upon millions of years, a great expanse of land stood firm against the weight of the seas. It was not vast by the measure of the continents we know today, but compared to the fleeting islands of fire and the fragile rafts of basalt that had come before, it was monumental. For the first time, the Earth had shaped a landmass that endured not for decades, not for centuries, but for eons. This was the dawn of stability. Picture it, a jagged plateau rising from the Archean seas, its surface dark and rough, streaked with veins of pale granite. Steam drifted from fissures, where the heat of the mantle still whispered upward, but the land no longer trembled with every breath of the earth below. Instead, it stood steady, anchored by roots that plunged deep into the crust. The waves crashed endlessly against its shores, tides pulled high and low by a moon that loomed enormous in the sky. Spray flew upward, glittering in the golden light of the sun. But no matter how the seas struck, the land remained. It was heavier now, thicker, buoyant enough to float upon the mantle without sinking, strong enough to withstand the constant assault of water. Above, the sky was different here. Winds that once swept endlessly across open oceans were split and diverted by the rising highlands. Clouds gathered more thickly, drawn to the peaks and ridges. Rains fell with new patterns, carving channels into the stone feeding streams that carried minerals into tide pools below. For the first time, the earth had places where water could linger, where streams could cut paths across rock, where the cycles of weather began to shape a landscape instead of only a sea. In these quiet pools, something extraordinary stirred. Microbial mats spread along the edges, glistening under the Archean sun. Pigments turned the water into subtle shades of green, orange, and purple. The earliest forms of life, still fragile, still humble, had new places to cling, cracks in the granite, hollows filled with rain, tide pools kissed by the sea. For them, the first continent was more than stone. It was home. At night, the land became a silhouette of permanence. Against the star-filled sky, its ridges and cliffs stood dark and steady, unmoved by the tides. Mist curled upward from valleys, softening the harsh outlines, turning the land into a dreamlike shape. The moon's reflection shimmered upon lakes and pools, turning them into mirrors of silver. And beneath it all, deep in the crust, The granite roots held firm, whispering endurance into the heart of the earth. The dawn of stability was not sudden. It did not come with a roar, but with patience. Each fragment that fused, each ridge that rose, each seam that cooled into stone added another layer of strength. Over millions of years, the earth had learned how to hold land, and once it learned, it did not forget. The world was no longer only a realm of oceans. It was becoming balanced: water and land, fire and stone, sea and sky. The first continent had arrived, humble though it was, and its presence changed everything. It shaped the winds, the rains, the tides. It offered life a foothold. It carried within its granite roots the memory of endurance, the promise of more continents to follow. And though it had no name then, we call it now by one: the first continent. A land both fragile and eternal, a beginning that would echo through the ages. This was the dawn of stability, the first time Earth found balance, the first time land truly belonged to the world. The first continent had risen, a cradle of granite and welded fragments, enduring against the weight of the Archean seas. But it was not only the vast plateau of land that mattered. It was also the edges, the meeting places where stone and water touched for the very first time. Here, in the liminal space between land and sea, the earth began to carve its coastlines. Picture the sight: waves rolling ceaselessly against cliffs of dark rock, foaming and breaking, wearing at their edges. The tides surged higher and lower than they do today, pulled by a moon that still lingered close in the sky. Twice each day, the ocean would retreat, leaving tide pools glistening in the sunlight, only to return with renewed force, battering the stone with spray and thunder. These shorelines were raw and jagged, freshly born, their cliffs black with basalt and pale with veins of granite. No sand softened their bases yet. The beaches were strewn with broken stone, sharp and angular, fragments torn free by waves. Pools gathered in hollows, shimmering with minerals carried from land and sea alike. Steam rose where rainwater met still warm rock, and mists curled above the waves, blurring the horizon into a dreamlike haze. It was here more than anywhere that the earth's elements met in endless conversation. The sea, restless and eternal, pressed forward. The land, steady but young, resisted. Between them, a boundary formed, not fixed, not permanent, but alive, shifting with every tide, every storm, every drop of rain. Imagine standing at the edge of this world. The continent stretches behind you, a rough plateau of stone, silent and immense. Before you, the sea spreads endlessly, its surface shimmering beneath a hazy Archean sun. The waves strike the rocks at your feet with steady rhythm, each one carrying away tiny fragments, each one returning to press again. You feel the spray upon your face, taste the salt upon your lips, hear the eternal dialogue of land and sea. In the tide pools, small wonders unfolded. Minerals dissolved and concentrated, mingling in shallow water warmed by sunlight. Tiny films of microbial life clung to rock, shimmering faintly with pigments. Cyanobacteria spread across the edges, forming mats that trapped bubbles of gas beneath them. Their colors painted the pools in greens and purples, living brushstrokes upon stone. With every tide, the pools refilled, replenished, and stirred. With every retreat, they left behind quiet laboratories where chemistry reached for life's deeper secrets. The storms shaped these shorelines as much as the tides. Winds swept across the open oceans, building waves that crashed in fury against the cliffs. Lightning split the seas, striking the waters, releasing energy that rippled through sea and pool alike. Rains fell in sheets, carving rivulets that wound their way down to the coast, carrying sediments that began, grain by grain, to soften the harsh edges of stone. Over time, the shorelines began to change. Cliffs broke into boulders, boulders into pebbles, pebbles into sand. Bays formed where the sea carved deeper into the land. Inlets filled with water, sheltered from the storm, becoming nurseries of calm. The coastlines grew diverse, sometimes jagged and fierce, sometimes gentle and inviting, always shifting, always alive. At night, the shorelines became something even more magical. The moon, enormous in the sky, cast silver light across the waves. The tides surged higher, their foaming edges glowing beneath the starlight. Pools glistened in the dark, reflecting the Milky Way above, so that it seemed as though the heavens had descended into the stone itself. The sound of waves, rhythmic and eternal, became a lullaby to the sleeping land. The shaping of shorelines was more than erosion, more than weather. It was the beginning of Earth's identity. Here, where sea and stone met, life found its first foothold. Here, the planet discovered its most dynamic boundary, a place that would forever define its landscapes, its cycles, its beauty. And so the first continent stood not only as a vast plateau, but as a mosaic of edges, cliffs, bays, inlets, and pools, each shaped by the embrace of the ocean, each carrying the memory of the tides. It was along these shorelines that the story of Earth turned its next page, one that would ripple outward for billions of years. The continent had risen, its roots anchored deep in the granite heart of the Earth. From its edges, the shorelines whispered with waves and tide pools, but inland, the land lifted higher, into ridges, plateaus, and mountains that stood tall above the Archean seas. These were the highlands, the first broad shoulders of the planet, standing firm against sky and storm. And they were cloaked in mist. The Archean atmosphere, rich in water vapor, carried thick clouds across the newborn land. Rains fell often, feeding streams that wound their way down into valleys, etching faint lines into the stone. But even when the rain ceased, the air remained damp, filled with a gentle haze that softened the outlines of ridges and peaks. The highlands seemed to drift in and out of sight, their jagged edges blunted by veils of vapor. Picture the scene: a plateau stretches before you, dark rock glistening with moisture. The air is cool and heavy, carrying the scent of wet stone. Streams cascade down the slopes in silver ribbons, their voices faint but steady, weaving songs that echo softly against the cliffs. Above, clouds curl around the peaks, wrapping them in white, as though the mountains are dreaming beneath a blanket of mist. The sunlight filters through, pale and golden, breaking the haze into beams that fall across the land. In those beams, the granite glitters faintly, crystals catching the light like scattered stars upon the earth. Pools of water shimmer where the rain has gathered, their surfaces dimpled by the last falling drops. The world feels hushed, as if time itself has slowed to watch. Here in the highlands, the earth seemed quieter than at the coasts. The thunder of waves was far away, replaced by the gentler voices of wind and water. The wind whispered across the ridges, carrying with it mists that curled through valleys, filling hollows with silver fog. Sometimes, entire slopes vanished into white, only to emerge again as the mist drifted and broke. It was a world half hidden, mysterious, as though the land itself wished to keep its secrets close. Yet even in this quiet, life stirred. Microbial mats clung to damp surfaces, painting the stone with faint films of green and purple. They spread across cracks, thriving in the constant moisture, their pigments shimmering faintly in the filtered light. In the pools that collected in hollows, bubbles of gas rose and burst, tiny signs of chemistry at work. Though invisible to the eye, these mists carried oxygen, the first whispers of a future yet to come. At night, the highlands were transformed. The mist thickened, blanketing the land in silence. The stars above glowed faintly through the haze, blurred but still present, their light diffused into soft halos. The moon loomed enormous, silver light pouring across the clouds, casting the mist into shimmering waves. Standing in such a place, the world would feel like a dream, stone beneath your feet, but all else softened into mystery. The highlands in mist were more than landscapes. They were symbols of Earth's patience, its new strength cloaked in gentleness. They showed that the continent was not only fire and stone, not only collision and upheaval. It could also be quiet. It could also be soft. It could cradle its strength in veils of vapor, blending raw endurance with beauty. And so, in the Archean dawn, the first mountains wore crowns of mist. The first plateaus stood wrapped in clouds. The first valleys filled with fog, streams whispering through their depths. The land was alive not only with fire but with water, not only with violence but with peace. This was the heart of the first continent, the highlands in mist, where Earth learned to balance its strength with serenity. The highlands stood wrapped in mist, their peaks softened by veils of vapor, their slopes glistening with rain. But water is never still for long. It seeks a path downward, always downward, and in doing so, it begins to shape the face of the world. At first, the rain fell in sheets, spreading evenly across the stone. It gathered in cracks, filled hollows, and clung to ridges in glistening rivulets. But gravity drew it forward, urging it to move, to carve a way across the land. Droplets became trickles, trickles became threads, threads became streams. and soon, across the surface of the first continent, the earliest rivers began to flow. Picture the scene, a plateau of dark granite and basalt, wet with recent rain. Tiny rivulets gather along its slope, weaving together into silver lines that shimmer in the pale Archean light. They join, merge, and spill downward into valleys that grow deeper with every passing storm. What begins as a faint scratch in stone becomes, over thousands of years, a channel. What begins as a channel becomes, over millions, a valley. The land that had once been bare now carries movement. The sound of water threads through the silence, soft trickles over stone, bubbling cascades where streams leap downward, the deeper hush of flow where valleys have grown. This is a new music for the earth, gentler than the roar of volcanoes, subtler than the crash of waves. It is the quiet persistence of water at work. These streams were unlike rivers today. There were no trees to line their banks, no reeds to sway in the current, no fish darting through their depths. They flowed through naked stone, their channels etched into rock, their waters carrying minerals drawn from the mountains above. They were clear in places, murky in others, tinted by iron and silicates. They shimmered under the Archean sun, threading across the land like veins of light. The valleys they carved were steep and raw at first, walls of stone rising sharply on either side, cut by the persistence of endless rainfall. Mist gathered in their depths, curling upward as streams met warmer air. Pools collected at their bases, their surfaces broken by ripples of falling water. In time, sediments carried by the streams softened their edges, filling the bottoms with sand and gravel, giving them form and texture. Imagine standing at the edge of one such valley. The air is damp and cool, heavy with the scent of wet stone. Below, a stream winds its way through the rocks, glinting as it catches the last rays of the sun. Its voice is soft but steady, a whisper that carries upward through the mist. The walls of the valley are dark and glistening, streaked with rivulets that shine like silver threads. Above, the sky is streaked with clouds, beams of light piercing through to touch the flowing water below. In these streams, chemistry stirred. Minerals dissolved and carried downstream gathered in pools, mingling into new combinations. Microbial mats clung to wet surfaces, spreading further than before, finding in the streams a constant supply of nutrients. The flowing water created diversity, a mosaic of habitats, each slightly different, each offering its own chance for life to thrive. At night, the valleys took on another character. Starlight spilled into their depths, reflected by the glistening streams below. The moon, enormous in the sky, pulled tides against the shorelines beyond, but here inland, it seemed only to cast its silver glow, turning each rivulet into a glowing thread, each pool into a mirror. The valleys became dreamscapes of light and shadow, their silence broken only by the eternal whisper of water moving ever downward. The streams did not rush. They were patient, like time itself. With every drop, every trickle, every storm, they deepened the valleys, broadened the channels, and shaped the land. They were sculptors of subtlety, carving beauty not in moments, but in millennia. The earth had given itself rivers, and with them, the first true landscapes were born. Not only highlands and ridges, but valleys and streams, places of motion and stillness, of sound and silence, of change and endurance. Here, in these carved paths of water, the first continent found its soul. The land had risen, the valleys had formed, and streams now carried water across the face of the first continent. But above it all, stretching endlessly, was the sky. The Archean skies were not passive, they were restless, alive, forever shifting. And now, with the birth of land, they found something new to play upon. Before continents, winds swept unhindered across the oceans, circling the globe in vast, uninterrupted currents. Clouds drifted endlessly, carrying rain from horizon to horizon with no mountain to catch them, no plateau to break their path. But once land rose, the rules changed. The highlands stood against the flow of air, the valleys carved channels through which winds whispered, the plateaus forced clouds to gather and release. The skies found themselves reshaped, as though the earth had offered them a partner to dance with. Picture the winds of the Archean. They were thicker than today's, heavy with gases we would find strange to breathe, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor. They rolled low over the seas, warm and damp, carrying mists that blurred the horizon. When they met the rising ridges of the first continent, they climbed upward, cooling as they rose. Clouds thickened, heavy with moisture, until they released their burden as rain. The mountains, newly born, became magnets for storms. The rains fell in torrents, sometimes for days without end. They pounded the slopes, feeding streams, filling valleys, cascading into the sea. Lightning arced through the clouds, striking the highlands with sudden brilliance, splitting the night sky into flashes of silver and white. Thunder rolled across the land, echoing off cliffs and plateaus, no longer lost into open ocean, but contained, amplified, until it seemed the earth itself was speaking. But there were gentler moments too. Between the storms, the skies softened. The clouds parted into drifting veils, through which the sun cast its pale, golden light. Beams fell across the land in quiet glory, touching ridges and valleys, illuminating mist that lingered like silk. The wind, once a roar, became a whisper, carrying cool dampness into hollows, brushing across the pools where microbial mats shimmered. Imagine standing upon one of these ridges, the sky stretched above you, the land stretching below. The wind moves steadily against your skin, carrying with it the scent of rain and the faint tang of minerals. Above, the clouds drift lazily, catching the sunlight in shades of white and gray. You hear the sigh of the wind moving through the valleys, a sound as soft and eternal as breath itself. At night, the skies were a world unto themselves. The haze of methane and dust softened the stars, but they still gleamed in brilliance, filling the heavens with endless points of light. The moon loomed enormous, pulling tides that crashed against the continent's edges, but here in the highlands, it seemed close enough to touch, its light silvering the clouds. Sometimes, the auroras shimmered faintly at the poles, colors rippling through the night as the Earth's young magnetic field danced with the solar wind. The atmosphere, alive and restless, worked hand in hand with the land. It carried rains that carved valleys, winds that shaped ridges, mists that softened the stone. And it brought rhythm, storms and calms, light and shadow, thunder and silence. Each cycle wove another layer of beauty into the first continent, reminding the land that it was never alone. The breath of the skies was more than the weather. It was Earth itself exhaling, the voice of the planet whispered across continents, spoken through winds and clouds. It was the balance of air and stone, the meeting of above and below. And in those breaths, the first continent learned that it was not only shaped by fire and water, but also by the endless, patient hand of the skies. Along the edges of the first continent, where stone met the restless sea, the tide performed its eternal rhythm. Twice each day, pulled by the nearness of the moon, the ocean surged forward, filling every hollow, every crevice, every rocky basin. Twice each day, it retreated again, leaving behind pools that glistened in the sun. These were the tide pools, the quiet pockets of ocean left stranded upon the land, shimmering with possibility. The shores themselves were jagged and raw, carved by waves into ridges and cliffs, but in their cracks and hollows, the sea lingered. Shallow pools formed where rainwater mixed with salt water, where minerals dissolved from the stone and swirled with those carried by the ocean. Their waters were warmed by sunlight, stirred by breezes, refreshed by every returning tide. They were small worlds unto themselves, each one slightly different, each one alive with potential. Imagine standing at the edge of one such pool. The rock beneath your feet is dark and rough, still damp from the retreating waves. Before you lies a basin of water, shallow and clear, its surface trembling with the breath of the wind. Tiny bubbles cling to the edges, catching the sunlight and gleaming like scattered gems. Beneath the surface, minerals swirl in faint colors, reds, greens, and purples, dissolved by the endless conversation of land and sea. In these pools, the first microbial mats spread more boldly than ever before. Thin films of cyanobacteria clung to the rocks, weaving across their surfaces like delicate lace. They shimmered in the Archean sunlight, their pigments capturing the faint rays of a younger, weaker sun and turning them into energy. Oxygen, invisible but profound, bubbled faintly into the water, gathering beneath the mats before rising into the air. The pools became laboratories of invention. With every cycle of tide and rain, their chemistry changed. When the sea swept in, it carried with it salts and minerals from the deep. When the waters retreated, the pools concentrated those elements, thickening into soups rich with possibility. Lightning occasionally split the skies above, striking the pools with sudden sparks of energy, stirring new reactions in their depths. In this endless cycle of filling and emptying, of dilution and concentration, the ingredients of life were mixed and remixed, again and again. The tide pools were quiet, but they were never still. Waves lapped against their edges, spilling over in foamy bursts. Winds brushed their surfaces into ripples, scattering sunlight into golden patterns across the stone. Raindrops fell, sending tiny circles dancing outward. At night, the moon cast its reflection into their waters, silver light mirrored in every pool, so that the shoreline glittered as though the stars themselves had descended to rest upon the land. And life, small though it was, thrived. These pools offered stability, a place safe from the fury of open seas, yet still connected to them. They were nurseries where the earliest microbes could anchor themselves, clinging to stone, feeding on light, multiplying slowly. Each tide renewed them, each retreat refined them. The pools became not only laboratories of chemistry, but sanctuaries of life. Imagine walking along such a shore in the Archean dusk. The air is heavy with mist, carrying the scent of salt and wet stone. The pools glisten at your feet, each one a tiny universe, quiet and self-contained. The waves crash beyond, but here in the shallows there is calm. You kneel beside a pool, watching the faint shimmer of microbial films spread across its surface, and though they are invisible to your eye, you sense their importance. You sense that something profound is stirring here, quietly, patiently, waiting for its time. The tide pools of possibility were humble. They were small, scattered, fragile, yet in them, the seeds of life took root more firmly than anywhere else. Here, in the meeting of land and sea, of light and stone, the earth found the perfect cradle for its first true experiments in living. And so, while the continent stretched vast and silent behind, and the ocean rolled endless before, the true miracle happened in the quiet places between, in tide pools that glistened like jewels along the edge of the world. The shorelines sparkled with tide pools, little jewels of possibility glistening beneath the Archean sun. But not all of life's promise unfolded in the open. Some of it retreated into the hidden places, into the cracks and fissures of stone, where water seeped, shadows lingered, and the world was sheltered from the fury of storm and tide. The first continent was not smooth. It was fractured, split by ancient eruptions and slow collisions. Everywhere the land bore seams, some wide enough to swallow rivers, others thin as hairlines but stretching for kilometers. Rain fell into these openings, trickling downward. Waves splashed into them, leaving behind briny pools that glimmered faintly in the dark. And in these secluded places, chemistry found a sanctuary. Picture it, a crevice along a granite slope, narrow and shaded, its floor wet with pooled water. Minerals seep in from the stone, dissolving slowly into the liquid. The air is heavy with dampness, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron and sulfur. The sun does not shine directly here, but light filters in faintly, caught on droplets that cling to the rock, scattering into soft glimmers. The world outside is loud with waves and wind, but here there is only stillness, the quiet heartbeat of water moving drop by drop. Microbial mats crept into these spaces, finding safety where the seas could not wash them away. Their filaments spread across the damp stone, clinging stubbornly in the darkness, feeding on light that filtered faintly from above or on chemical reactions that stirred in the mineral-rich pools. Oxygen gathered in tiny bubbles, trapped between the mats and the rock, each one a whisper of the transformation to come. The cracks became refuges. In the open tide pools, life was exposed to storms, to heat, to the pounding of waves. Here in the shadows, it could persist undisturbed. Water did not drain away as quickly. Nutrients lingered longer. The mats had time to spread, to thicken, to multiply. What the sea carved in grandeur, the cracks nurtured in secrecy. At times, lightning split the skies above, and rainwater, energized by the strike, poured into the fissures, carrying with it new combinations of molecules. At other times, the warmth of the sun heated the surface, and that warmth seeped downward, stirring chemical dances in the pools below. Always, the cracks remained ready, holding the ingredients, protecting the fragile beginnings. Imagine leaning close to one such fissure in the Archean dusk. You hear the faint drip of water echoing in its depths, a sound soft and eternal. You see the shimmer of moisture along its walls, each droplet catching the fading light. If you could look closer still, beyond human sight, you would see the delicate threads of microbial life weaving across the surface, quiet architects of a future no one could yet imagine. At night, the cracks were hidden in darkness, their waters reflecting only slivers of moonlight. The world outside roared with tides and storms, but within the fissures, silence held steady. The mats continued their quiet work, unseen, uncelebrated, yet tireless. The continent itself seemed to cradle them, offering sanctuary in its stone. These cracks in the rock were not grand. They were not vast oceans or soaring mountains, but they were vital. They were nurseries where life could endure, protected from violence, given the patience of time to grow. In their narrow walls, the earth whispered a truth, that greatness often begins in hidden places, in the smallest, quietest shelters. And so, as the tides swept over the shorelines and storms lashed the highlands, the cracks in the rock held something precious. They held endurance. They held persistence. They held the fragile beginnings of life's story, tucked away in the silent heart of the first continent. Life in the Archean was fragile, microscopic, unseen to the human eye, but it was also persistent. In tide pools, in cracks in the rock, in the thin films along the shoreline, the first photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria, took hold. And once they found a foothold, they began to spread. At first, they were no more than delicate threads, faint mats clinging to wet surfaces. Their pigments caught the weak sunlight of a younger sun, turning it into energy, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. That oxygen, at first, dissolved into the surrounding water, where it bonded with iron and minerals. But the process continued, day after day, tide after tide, until the impact began to ripple outward. Imagine the surface of a tide pool at dawn. The Archean sky glows hazy gold, the water still and clear. Along the edges, a thin green film clings to the stone. It ripples faintly in the breeze, shimmering with tiny bubbles that rise slowly to the surface. These bubbles pop silently, vanishing into the air, carrying with them a gas invisible but transformative, oxygen. It is not yet abundant enough to fill the skis, but it is there, accumulating drop by drop, breath by breath, as countless cyanobacteria work in quiet unison. Their colonies spread outward with every tide. When waves returned, they tore fragments of the mats free, carrying them to new cracks and pools, where they anchored again and began to grow. Some drifted farther, settling on submerged rocks just beneath the waterline. Slowly, they expanded beyond the sheltered crevices of the continent, weaving carpets across shallow seas, turning lifeless stone into living green. The continent itself became flecked with color. From afar, the highlands still looked dark and raw, cloaked in mist and shadow. But along the shorelines, subtle hues appeared, green and purple sheens on wet stone, patches of pigment glowing faintly under the Archean sun. The barren edges of the world were no longer truly barren. They were alive. This spread was not dramatic, not sudden. It was patient, unfolding over millions of years, but it was relentless. The cyanobacteria did not need grandeur. They needed only time, water, and sunlight. And in the Archean, time stretched endlessly, offering them all they required. Imagine wandering across the rocky shore at midday. The pools glisten, shimmering with life. Thin layers of microbial mats cover their surfaces, catching the light, their pigments shifting in subtle tones. Tiny bubbles rise constantly, breaking the silence with faint pops, though you hear only the waves beyond. The air above feels different here, still heavy with methane and haze, but tinged with the faintest promise of oxygen. The cyanobacteria were not merely spreading, they were transforming the planet. The oxygen they released began to react with dissolved iron in the oceans, falling as rust-red layers to the seafloor. Slowly, the chemistry of Earth shifted. It was still early, still subtle, but the foundation of the great oxygenation to come was already being laid. At night, the colonies rested, but their presence lingered. Pools glistened beneath the moonlight, mats glowed faintly with moisture, and bubbles of gas shimmered like tiny pearls before drifting upward. In the silence of the Archean night, the work of day was not undone. It carried forward, quietly, steadily, into eternity. The spread of cyanobacteria was humble in appearance. It did not reshape mountains or carve valleys, yet its influence was greater than any eruption or collision of stone. For in their quiet persistence, these microscopic pioneers rewrote the future of Earth. They seeded the air with the breath that would one day sustain forests, animals, and people. They painted the first continent with the earliest signs of living color. They turned barren shores into living landscapes. The Earth had given birth to its first continent, and life, in turn, had begun to claim it. The stones held memory, the waters carried movement, and now the land itself bore the touch of living green. The spread of cyanobacteria was the beginning of transformation, small, silent, but unstoppable. The first continent stood in strength, its highlands wrapped in mist, its valleys carved by streams, its shores etched with tide pools shimmering under the Archean sun. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of beauty began to spread across the stone. Where once the land was only grey and black, painted in tones of rock and shadow, new colors began to appear, subtle at first, but deepening with every passing age. This was the work of life. The cyanobacteria, humble and patient, were not content to remain in cracks and shallow pools. They spread across wet stone, forming mats that shimmered in the light. Their pigments, crafted to catch the sun's energy, painted the surfaces in hues unknown to the lifeless world before them. Greens spread like veils across the rocks, purples and reds appeared in shaded pools, browns and golds shimmered faintly in the damp hollows. The coloring of the world had begun. Imagine walking along the shoreline at dawn. The tide has just retreated, leaving behind pools and slick stone. The air is cool, filled with mist. Across the wet surfaces, thin films of life gleam faintly, their pigments catching the pale sunlight. Greens ripple across the rocks, not like grass or moss, those would not come for billions of years, but like soft veils of color, spread low and thin, hugging the stone. Purples shimmer in deeper pools, their shades changing as the light shifts. The land is no longer bare, it is alive with color. Even the waters themselves began to change. The oxygen released by cyanobacteria met the iron dissolved in the seas, forming rust-red sediments that drifted downward, layering upon the seafloor. The oceans, once dark and greenish-black, began to glimmer with patches of red where sediments gathered. From above, the seas were still vast and powerful, but closer to shore, their colors deepened, shifting in strange, mesmerizing hues. Storms too painted the land in their way. Rains washed microbial mats into rivulets, leaving streaks of color down the slopes. Pools filled with pigments swirled into patterns as the winds brushed their surfaces. In the golden light after a storm, the land gleamed with living tones, subtle but undeniable, a canvas painted not by fire or stone, but by life itself. At night, the colors did not vanish. They deepened. Under the enormous moon, the microbial mats gleamed faintly, reflecting silver light in soft shades. Pools mirrored the stars, their pigments bending starlight into shifting patterns. The land seemed to glow with a quiet aura, alive even in darkness, whispering of the transformations unfolding upon its surface. The coloring of the world was not dramatic like an eruption, not sudden like a storm. It was patient, unfolding over millions of years, yet it was profound. For the first time, the earth was not merely grey stone and blue sea. It was painted. It was alive. These colors told a story. They were more than beauty, they were survival. Each pigment was a tool, crafted by life to capture energy, to shield against harsh light, to thrive in shifting conditions. The greens, the purples, the browns, they were signatures of life's adaptability, its quiet determination to endure. And together, they turned the face of the first continent into something new, something vibrant, something unmistakably alive. Imagine once more, standing upon that land, watching the Archean sun rise through mist. The mountains loom dark above, but their slopes shimmer faintly with veils of color. The valleys carry streams that gleam with pigments carried downstream. The tide pools glitter with greens and purples, tiny universes painted by life. The world is no longer a silent stage of stone and water. It is a living canvas, and the artists are microbes no larger than dust. The earth had begun to dream in color, and it would never be the same again. The shorelines were painted in color now. Green and purple veils of cyanobacteria spread across stone, shimmering in the light of the Archean sun. The pools glistened with pigments, the cracks in the rock harbored hidden colonies, and the seas themselves bore the faint breath of oxygen. The world, once only stone and sea, now carried the touch of life. But life was not only spreading, it was experimenting. Each bubble of oxygen, each pigment capturing light, each fragment of microbial mat was part of a greater dance. These were the first biochemical footsteps, small, tentative, but profound. In the tide pools, where sunlight warmed shallow water, reactions stirred. Molecules assembled and disassembled, carried on currents of evaporation and replenishment. Pigments not only caught light, but shielded against its harsher rays, offering protection as well as sustenance. Within the mats, filaments of life began to specialize, some better at catching light, others better at binding nutrients, all working together in a quiet symphony of survival. Imagine kneeling beside one such pool. Its waters are shallow, tinted faintly green. Tiny bubbles rise steadily, bursting at the surface in silent pops. If you could look closer, beneath the rippling surface, you would see the mats weaving themselves into layers, each one alive, each one busy with tasks too small for the eye. They are not conscious in any sense we know, but they persist, adapt, and grow. Their chemistry is their language, their molecules, their tools. The oxygen they release does not yet fill the skis, but it gathers in whispers. At first, it is caught by iron in the seas, falling to the seafloor in layers of rust-red sediment. But the process does not stop. It cannot stop. Day after day, sunlight fuels the mats, and day after day, oxygen is released. It is invisible, silent, but it is reshaping the planet's future with every breath. The mats also learned resilience. When waves tore them from their rocks, fragments drifted until they found new footholds, anchoring in fresh cracks and pools. When storms churned the seas, some colonies perished, but others survived, spreading anew. Each failure became an opportunity, each success a step forward. In their quiet persistence, life was teaching itself endurance. At night, the pools held the memory of day. Their surfaces gleamed beneath the moon's silver light, their bubbles slowed but steady, their mats glistening with moisture. The stars reflected above, mirrored in the pools below, as though the cosmos itself leaned close to watch. In the silence of the Archean night, these pools whispered of change, change so slow it could not be seen, but so vast it would alter everything. The biochemical footsteps of the Archean were humble. They did not roar like volcanoes or thunder like storms. They whispered. They painted stone with color. They exhaled bubbles of oxygen. They wove films across water. Yet in these whispers lay the foundation for forests and animals, rivers filled with fish, skis filled with wings. The earth itself seemed to cradle these beginnings, offering cracks, pools, and shorelines as sanctuaries. Fire had built the continent, water had shaped it, and now life was beginning to claim it, not with conquest, but with patience, pigment, and breath. These were the first biochemical footsteps, and though they were small, they were steady. They carried the weight of all that would come after, paving a path toward the great blossoming of life that lay far ahead. And so, in the quiet corners of the first continent, the smallest of creatures began the largest of journeys. The first continent had risen. Streams flowed across its slopes, mists cloaked its highlands, tide pools glistened with life, and colors spread along its edges. Chemistry was stirring, oxygen was whispering, microbes were spreading. And yet, despite all of this motion, the pace of change was slow, so slow that to human eyes it might have seemed as though nothing happened at all. This was the long silence, the vast intervals of time when Earth simply waited. Imagine the world stretched across millions upon millions of years. Volcanoes erupted from time to time, yes. Storms swept across the seas, mountains rose and crumbled, but most days were quiet. The sun rose and fell, painting the sky in hazy hues of gold and red. The tides surged and retreated twice every day, their rhythm unchanged. The winds whispered across the land, carrying mist and rain. It was a cycle so steady, so constant, that it might have felt eternal. In these stretches, the earth seemed to breathe slowly. The land endured, the seas rolled, the skis shifted. Life went about its patient work, unseen and unheard, multiplying in cracks and pools, weaving mats across stone, releasing bubbles of oxygen. The changes were profound, but they unfolded in silence, in a tempo too vast for the moment to measure. Picture standing upon the shore of the first continent during such a silence. The waves lap softly against the rocks, their rhythm unbroken. The pools glisten with faint films of microbial mats, shimmering under the weak sunlight. Nothing stirs beyond the water's edge, no birds in the sky, no animals upon the land, no plants swaying in the breeze. Only the sigh of wind, the hush of waves, the drip of water into cracks. It is a vast, beautiful, and profound world. At night, the silence deepens. The stars blaze above, mirrored in the tide pools below. The moon, closer than it will ever be again, hangs enormous in the sky, pulling the seas in great tides that surge against the land. Yet even in its restlessness, the planet feels hushed. The microbes continue their quiet work. The chemistry continues its endless dance, but no sound marks their labor. The silence is total, vast, infinite. The long silence was not emptiness, it was patience. The earth was not rushing. It was content to let life take its time, to let stone settle, to let oceans and skies play their parts. Every bubble of oxygen, every pigment upon rock, every drop of rain carving valleys was a step forward, but the steps were so small that only eternity could see the dance. This silence taught the planet endurance. It allowed the first continent to hold steady, to test its strength against the sea and sky. It allowed life to root itself more firmly, to experiment in countless ways, to fail and try again without haste. It gave the world space to grow slowly, deeply, unhurried. Imagine the scale. 1,000 lifetimes could pass without a visible change, and yet, across millions of years, the silence was shaping the future. Valleys deepened, rivers carved their paths, mountains softened, oxygen gathered in whispers, iron fell to the seafloor in rust-red layers, and the stage was being set for transformations unthinkable. The long silence was not absence, it was foundation. It was the earth holding its breath, allowing all that was fragile to become strong. And so the first continent stood in quiet dignity, the seas rolled against its edges, the skies drifted above, and life whispered in pools and cracks. Nothing grand happened, not in the way we might expect, but everything was happening, patiently, invisibly, in the hush of time. This was the long silence, the greatest teacher of all. The mountains softened, the valleys deepened, the streams whispered across the land, and the skies breathed endlessly above. The first continent had taken shape, quiet yet enduring. And while rains and tides wore at its surface, while storms reshaped its edges, there was something within it that did not forget. The stones remembered. Deep within the continent lay its roots, vast slabs of granite and welded fragments pressed together by fire and time. These cratons, thick and buoyant, anchored the land against the restless mantle below. They were not fleeting like volcanic islands, nor fragile like basalt rafts. They were ancient, immovable, built to last, and in their stillness they carried memory. Every eruption, every collision, every storm was written into their layers. Each seam of cooled magma marked a moment of fire. Each fold of stone told the story of a collision deep beneath the seas. Each vein of crystal spoke of slow cooling, of patience, of endurance. To look into these rocks, if one could, was to look into the diary of the earth itself, an account written not in words, but in minerals, textures, and scars. Imagine standing upon one of these cratonic plains in the Archean dawn. Beneath your feet lies stone that will outlast oceans and mountains, stone that will persist for billions of years. It feels solid, unyielding, eternal. But if you could listen closely, you might hear its whispers, not in sound, but in presence. The weight of memory hums within it, the story of the earth's youth bound into its fabric. The rains fell upon its surface, carving rivers and valleys, but they could not erase the heart of the land. The winds sighed across its ridges, shaping slopes, but they could not touch the deep roots. Even as the surface changed, the cratons endured. They held the memory of every step that had come before, the rise of islands, the fury of collisions, the dawn of stability. At night, when the moon cast silver light across the highlands, the stones seemed to glow with their own quiet dignity. They did not move, they did not speak, but they radiated permanence. The stars blazed above, the seas whispered below, but the stones simply remained, keepers of a history too ancient for the skies to remember. Life, fragile though it was, clung to these stones. Microbial mats spread across their surfaces, unaware of the vast story beneath them. In cracks and pools, bubbles rose, oxygen whispered, and chemistry stirred. Yet beneath these humble beginnings lay the foundation of permanence. The cratons, the memory keepers, ensuring that the continent would not vanish, that its history would endure. The stones remembered the long silence. They remembered the first colors painted by microbes, the first streams that carved valleys, the first mists that cloaked highlands. They remembered not with words, but with layers, with scars, with the quiet endurance of their being. And so, as the world rolled forward, as storms came and went, as life spread slowly across its edges, the stones carried on. They waited patiently, holding the memory of Earth's first chapter. To walk upon them, if one could, was to walk upon time itself, to feel beneath your feet the record of fire and water, of silence and patience, of beginnings written into the very bones of the world. The stones remembered, and because they remembered, the earth would never forget where it began. On the surface, the first continent seemed steady. Its highlands wore crowns of mist, its valleys carried streams, its shorelines whispered with waves and tide pools shimmering in the sunlight. To the eye, it appeared as though the earth had found peace at last, a balance of stone and sea, air and life. But beneath the stillness, deep within the planet's heart, the fires never rested. The mantle churned ceaselessly below, its vast currents moving like slow rivers of stone. Columns of heat rose upward, plumes pressing against the crust, searching for weakness. Magma pooled in hidden chambers, glowing in the darkness, waiting for release. Even as the cratons anchored themselves firmly against the mantle, even as granite spread its quiet strength, the restless fire below continued its eternal work. Imagine descending into that hidden world. The surface grows distant, the light fades, and the air grows heavy with heat. The ground itself glows faintly, deep reds and golds pulsing like embers. Rivers of molten rock flow slowly through unseen channels, thicker than water, heavier than steel, yet moving with patient certainty. The silence here is immense, broken only by the deep, low murmur of stone pressing against stone. From time to time, the fire found its way upward. A fissure opened in the crust, and lava surged through, spilling across the surface in glowing rivers. Steam roared as it met the sea, ash drifted into the skies, and the continent trembled with the heartbeat of the mantle. These eruptions were less frequent now than in the earliest days, but they were reminders that the earth was never truly still. Even when the land above seemed quiet, the fires beneath still burned. They warmed the roots of the cratons, fed the volcanic arcs, and drove the slow drift of fragments across the mantle. They whispered through geysers and hot springs, sending plumes of steam into the air. They gave life to the cracks and tide pools above, feeding them with minerals and energy, fueling the chemistry of possibility. Picture a valley upon the first continent, rain falling softly across its slopes. Streams run downward into a quiet basin, where a hot spring bubbles faintly, warmed by unseen fires. The water steams in the cool air, carrying with it the scent of sulfur and minerals. Microbial mats cling to the edges, thriving in the warmth, glowing faintly with pigments. To any observer, this would appear a sanctuary of life, but beneath, it is the mantle's gift, the fires beneath still feeding the world above. At night, the fires made themselves known in subtler ways. The land might tremble faintly, a whisper of pressure building deep below. In distant valleys, steam rose more heavily, glowing under the moon's light like silver breath. Sometimes, faint eruptions lit the horizon, their glow reflected in the seas, as though the earth's hidden heart had broken through its silence to remind the skies of its presence. The fires beneath were not enemies of the land. They were its foundation, its fuel, its unseen strength. Without them, the continent could not have risen. Without them, the granite roots would not have formed. Without them, the chemistry of life would not have been fed with minerals and heat. The cratons remembered the past, but the mantle was the present, always moving, always burning, always shaping. The two together created balance, stone to endure, fire to renew. And so, while the first continent stood in dignity above, the earth's heart still pulsed below. The fires never ceased, never dimmed, never forgot their role. They continued their quiet labor, ensuring that the surface would remain alive, that the story would not end in silence. The fires beneath still burned, and they always would. The first continent stood steady, its granite roots anchored deep, its valleys carved by streams, its shores painted with microbial mats shimmering under the Archean sun. For the first time in Earth's history, something felt permanent, and yet permanence was an illusion. Beneath the still surface, the planet was never still. The mantle continued its slow, tireless churn, currents of molten stone rising and sinking with rhythms measured in millions of years. Those currents tugged at the crust above, pulling it this way and that, testing the strength of the first continent. Though the granite held firm, it was not immune. The land was heavy, but it floated upon the mantle like a raft, and rafts, however steady, drift when the waters below move. And so, the first continent began to drift. It was not fast, To human eyes, it would have seemed frozen in place. Mountains still loomed, rivers still flowed, tides still rose and fell. But over the course of millions of years, the land shifted. It crept across the planet's surface, carried upon the mantle's slow breath. To the oceans, it was as though a new shape was carving its way through their depths, altering currents, bending tides, reshaping the very rhythm of the seas. Picture it in the vastness of time, the continent inching forward, its edges grinding against volcanic arcs, its shores colliding with smaller fragments of land. When two pieces met, mountains rose. When they parted, rifts opened, filling with water. The surface of Earth was no longer static, it had become a moving puzzle, its pieces colliding, separating, and colliding again. This was the beginning of plate tectonics as we know it, though in its infancy, it was clumsy and irregular. Plates moved unevenly, breaking and reforming in fits of energy, but the principle was there. The surface of Earth was not fixed. It was alive, restless, in motion. Imagine standing upon the highlands of the first continent. To you, nothing seems to change. The wind whispers, the rains fall, the streams trickle toward the sea, but unseen beneath your feet, the land is on a journey. In the span of a lifetime, it travels less than the width of a hand. In the span of 1,000 lifetimes, it moves far enough to change the face of the world. The drift shaped everything above. Shorelines shifted as the land pushed outward. Valleys deepened as the crust stretched and fractured. Volcanoes erupted where plates pulled apart, pouring fresh stone across the landscape. Microbial mats spread into new pools created by shifting tides. Life followed the land's motion, carried into new places, given new opportunities to endure. At night, beneath the glow of the moon, the continent's edges cracked and shifted in silence. The stars overhead bore witness to movements too slow for their brilliance to record, yet they reflected faintly in the waters that filled the rifts, reminding the land that it was never still. The earth itself was drifting, dreaming in stone, carried by fires beneath that never ceased. This drift was the beginning of a story that would never end. In ages to come, continents would split and join, collide to form supercontinents, break apart again, drifting across the globe in endless cycles. Mountains would rise and fall, seas would open and close, life would ride upon the drifting rafts of stone to every corner of the world. But it all began here, in the Archean, with the first continent and its quiet motion across the planet's face. The drift of continents had begun, and with it, Earth became a world forever in motion. The first continent drifted slowly across the vast Archean seas, carried upon the mantle's hidden currents. To human eyes, the land seemed still, eternal. The highlands remained cloaked in mist, rivers whispered in their valleys, and tide pools shimmered with microbial life. Yet beneath the silence, change was constant. The drifting, grinding, colliding motions of stone were writing the script of Earth, tomorrow. The continent itself was small compared to the giants of later ages, but it carried within it the seeds of everything to come. Its granite roots were strong, buoyant, and enduring. Its surface bore the scars of collisions, the softening touch of rivers, the colors of microbial mats. It was a living laboratory, not only for life, but for the planet itself, a place where the Earth tested its strength, experimented with motion, and set patterns that would echo across billions of years. Every shift of the land was a rehearsal. When a fragment of crust collided with the continent's edge, mountains rose, proving that stone could be lifted toward the skies. When rifts opened, pulling the land apart, valleys deepened into basins that hinted at the seas yet to come. Each event was a quiet lesson, teaching the Earth how to sculpt itself, how to hold land, how to balance sea and stone. Imagine standing on a rocky ridge, looking out across the Archean horizon. The sea stretches endlessly before you, but behind you lies something new, land that will not sink, stone that will not vanish. You feel the ground humming faintly beneath your feet, a whisper of the mantle's restless movements below. You do not see the drift, but you sense it, the promise that the land is not fixed, that it carries within it the power to reshape itself endlessly. The microbes spreading across the shores and cracks knew nothing of tomorrow, yet they were part of it. Their pigments painted the land, their oxygen filled the seas, their persistence turned silence into transformation. With every bubble that rose from a tide pool, with every film of green that spread across stone, they were laying foundations for a future they could not imagine. At night, the shaping of tomorrow was visible in the stars. The continent, drifting slowly across the globe, was like a raft floating beneath a cosmic river of light. The Milky Way arched above, reflected faintly in the pools and streams, as though the heavens themselves were writing upon the land. The moon, closer than it will ever be again, pulled tides with great force, reshaping coasts, sculpting shorelines, reminding the world that nothing was ever still. The shaping of tomorrow was not grand, not sudden. It was quiet, patient, unfolding across spans of time beyond comprehension. The earth did not rush. It dreamed in stone, sculpting a blueprint that would one day give rise to vast continents: Laurentia, Gondwana, Pangaea. Forests and rivers, deserts and plains, mountains that touched the sky, all of it began here, in the drifting of the first continent, in the experiments of the Archean. And though the world was still empty of trees and animals, it was already alive with promise. The shapes of tomorrow were etched in granite, whispered in oxygen bubbles, carved by rivers, and carried by drifting land. The first continent was not only a presence, it was a prophecy. In its slow drift, in its quiet endurance, it carried the memory of all the worlds yet to come. The first continent drifted across the Archean seas, a solitary raft of stone upon an oceanic world. It was small compared to what would come, a plateau of granite roots and volcanic scars, but it was more than land. It was a prototype, a teacher, a cradle for every continent that would one day rise from the deep. For the first time, Earth had proven that land could last. Basalt had risen before in fiery arcs and volcanic rafts, but it always sank, always broke apart, always returned to the mantle's restless fire. Granite was different. It was lighter, more buoyant, able to float upon the mantle without sinking back into its depths. The cratons that formed within the first continent became seeds of permanence, anchors that no storm, no tide, no passing age could erase. Imagine standing upon this continent at dawn. The horizon is still mostly ocean, stretching endlessly in every direction, but beneath your feet is stone that will not vanish. Its roots reach deep, holding fast against the mantle's pull. Around you, rivers carve valleys, rain fills pools, microbial mats shimmer with life. Everything feels small, fragile even, but the foundation is eternal. What you stand upon will outlast seas, outlast mountains, outlast even the stars overhead. The first continent was not merely land. It was the idea of land made real. Every continent that would follow, vast Gondwana, sprawling Pangaea, the familiar outlines of Africa, Asia, the Americas, would carry within it the memory of this first one. Each would be built from fragments anchored by cratons, those ancient granite roots that were born in the Archean. Each would follow the same principles: drift upon the mantle, collide and merge, break apart and reform, forever repeating the pattern first tested here. In this way, the first continent became a cradle. It nurtured life by providing cracks, pools, and sheltered shores. It nurtured the planet by showing that stone could endure, that stability was possible. And it nurtured the future by giving Earth its blueprint, its method of creating continents again and again. At night, beneath the silver light of the moon, the truth of this cradle was written in silence. The stars reflected in tide pools, the land stood firm against the waves, and deep below, the granite roots whispered of permanence. The world had begun with chaos, with fire and storm, with oceans swallowing every fragment. But now, at last, something has changed. The land was here to stay. The microbes that spread across its surfaces were unaware, yet they were part of the story. They painted the stone with pigments, released oxygen into the air, and laid the groundwork for futures unimaginable. Just as the continent was a cradle for land, they were a cradle for life. Together, they formed the dual foundation of everything that would come: Earth as a planet of continents, and Earth as a planet of life. The cradle of continents was humble in size, silent in presence, but immense in meaning. It was the proof of endurance, the promise of tomorrow, the anchor upon which the planet's story would be written. And though the seas still ruled the majority of Earth's surface, the balance had shifted forever. Land was no longer a fleeting guest, it was a permanent resident. The world had entered a new age. The cradle of continents had been built, and from it, all future lands would be born. The first continent stood steady, drifting slowly across the Archean seas. Its roots reached deep into the mantle, anchoring it with granite strength. Its shores whispered with waves, its valleys carried streams, its pools shimmered with life. From above, it seemed eternal, a place fixed and immovable. But in truth, it endured only because the earth was patient, immeasurably patient. Time to the earth was not measured in years or centuries, but in millions upon millions of cycles of sun and moon. To human eyes, the land would have seemed unchanged. The mountains stood where they always had, the rivers carved their valleys in familiar paths, the tides rose and fell in steady rhythm. And yet, beneath the silence of days and nights, the continent was always changing, reshaped by forces too vast to be hurried. This was the endless patience of Earth. Imagine standing upon the shore at dusk, the sea before you glowing faintly under the silver light of the moon. The waves rise and fall as they always have, steady, eternal. Behind you, the highlands stand cloaked in mist, streams threading through their valleys. You might believe that nothing will ever alter this scene, that the world is fixed forever in this moment of quiet beauty. But the earth knows better. It knows that change is constant, but it comes in whispers, in increments so small that only time itself can measure them. Rain falls endlessly, drop by drop, carving the stone. Winds sigh across the ridges, carrying dust that slowly wears the slopes smooth. Rivers carry sediments to the sea, grain by grain, building the edges of deltas that will one day shape new coasts. Volcanic fires stir beneath the crust, waiting for their time to rise. The continent drifts inch by inch, carried on the mantle's breath. None of it is hurried, none of it is wasted. The patience of Earth is not passive, it is creative. By refusing to rush, the planet allows its mountains to rise in grandeur, its valleys to deepen in beauty, its life to spread and adapt. Every slow step is deliberate, each cycle of erosion and renewal a part of the greater story. The Earth has no need for haste, for it has all the time in the universe. At night, the stars remind us of this patience. They shine as they always have, but even they are in motion, drifting across the galaxy with the same unhurried rhythm. The moon, though enormous now, will one day drift farther from Earth, its tides lessened, but not for billions of years. Time stretches outward in both directions, infinite and steady, carrying the planet gently forward. Life, too, was shaped by this patience. The cyanobacteria that spread across the shores did not bloom in days or years. They grew in layers, building slowly, adapting quietly, their influence only visible when measured in ages. The oxygen they released did not flood the skies overnight. It took hundreds of millions of years. Yet with every bubble, with every pigment, they shaped the future. This is the truth of the Earth. Its greatness lies not in haste, but in patience. The first continent endured not because it was unchanging, but because it was allowed to change slowly, in balance, in time's own rhythm. And so the Earth continued its long silence, its endless patience. The continent drifted, the seas whispered, the skies breathed, and life spread across its edges. Nothing seemed to happen at the moment, yet everything was happening. The world was being prepared, shaped gently, sculpted carefully for all that would come after. The patience of Earth was its greatest strength, and it was endless. The first continent drifted slowly across the Archean seas, small and solitary, but it carried within its roots a strength that would outlast oceans, storms, and ages. Though it has long since fractured, scattered, and merged into lands unrecognizable, pieces of it still remain, buried deep within the continents we walk upon today. The Earth does not forget. Cratons, those ancient granite hearts, lie hidden beneath modern mountains, deserts, and forests. They are the survivors of deep time, fragments of the first land that rose against the sea. Africa holds them, Australia too. Greenland carries some of the oldest, and even beneath North America lie pieces of stone that once formed part of that first cradle. To walk upon them is to stand upon memories older than imagination, older than life itself. Imagine placing your hand upon a weathered rock in a quiet forest today. Moss covers its surface, birds sing above, rivers run nearby. To the eye, it is simply part of the landscape, but deep within its minerals lies a story billions of years old, a memory of when the world was young, when no tree had yet grown, no creature had yet walked, no forest had yet rustled. This rock is more than stone, it is a fragment of home, a piece of Earth's earliest dream. The memory of that first continent is not loud. It does not shout from mountaintops or blaze across skies. It whispers, it lingers in the quiet resilience of granite, in the stubbornness of cratons that refuse to sink, in the endurance of stone that has survived fire, storm, and silence. These fragments are the foundations upon which every modern continent is built, the bones of Earth's earliest age still carrying its weight. At night, when stars blaze above modern lands, the memory deepens. The continents drift as they always have, mountains rise and fall, rivers carve valleys, seas come and go. But beneath it all, the ancient roots endure. They are unchanged, untouched, silent witnesses to billions of years. They remember the first rains, the first tide pools, the first colors of life. They remember the long silence, the fires beneath, the endless patience of Earth. The continents we know, vast and green, alive with forests and cities, are not entirely new. They are mosaics, stitched together from fragments of that first home. Every step we take upon them is, in some quiet way, a step upon the memory of the Archean. The Earth, in its patience, has carried those fragments forward, refusing to let them vanish. And so, wherever we are, whether we stand upon granite peaks, desert plateaus, or quiet valleys, we are never far from the first continent. Its memory is beneath us, within us, around us, the silent foundation of the world we know. The ancient memory of home is not gone. It endures in stone, whispering softly that we are all children of the first land. The first continent stood firm, its granite roots anchoring it to the restless mantle, its highlands wrapped in mist, its valleys carrying streams, its shores alive with tide pools shimmering under the Archean sun. To the microbes that clung to its cracks, it was simply a home. To the oceans that beat upon its edges, it was merely resistance. To the skies above, it was a stage for wind and storm. But to the Earth itself, this continent was something more, a promise, a whisper of all that would follow. The stones spoke softly to the future. Each craton, each granite shard, each mountain lifted by collisions carried within it the seed of tomorrow. They were not just fragments of land, they were rehearsals for continents yet to be. The patterns set in these early days, the rising and falling of mountains, the drifting of land upon the mantle, the patient carving of valleys by rain, would repeat endlessly. They would shape Gondwana, Pangaea, and every modern continent. They would sculpt landscapes for forests, deserts, rivers, and plains. They would provide the stage for animals, for humans, for civilizations yet unimagined. Imagine standing upon that ancient land at sunset. The tide pools glisten with microbial films, their pigments catching the fading light. The winds sweep softly across the highlands, carrying the coolness of evening. Above, the moon glows immense, pulling the seas in great tides that crash against the rocks. Nothing moves upon the land save for water and wind. And yet within it, the earth is whispering to the oceans, to the skies, to the silent mats of life, that this is only the beginning. The whispers are not in words, but in endurance. They are carried in the permanence of granite, in the resilience of microbial mats, in the quiet patience of rivers carving their way to the sea. They are carried in the steady drift of land across the mantle, a reminder that the earth will never stand still. They are carried in oxygen bubbles rising from pools, invisible yet destined to reshape the sky. At night, the whispers feel louder. The stars blaze above, their light stretching across the void of time, mirrored in the tide pools below. The moon hangs close, silvering the land. The continent lies silent, but the silence is full of promise. In the dark, you might almost feel the hum of the Earth's future, the sense that this quiet stone will one day bear forests, rivers, mountains taller than any yet dreamed. That this land, or pieces of it, will cradle the footsteps of countless beings who have not yet come into existence. The whispers to the future spoke of cycles. Land would rise and fall, drift and collide, break and reform. Life would spread, change, adapt and flourish. Nothing would remain exactly as it was, and yet through all of it, the memory of the first continent would endure in every fragment, every craton, every root of stone. The first continent was more than land. It was a message, a gentle promise from the earth to itself: I can endure, I can create, I can carry life. And though billions of years have passed since those Archean days, the whispers remain. They echo in the mountains that rise today, in the continents that drift across the globe, in the breath of life that fills the air. They remind us that everything we know began in silence, in patience, in a continent that dared to rise from the sea and whisper to the future. The first continent had risen, endured, and drifted across the Archean seas. It had given the world its first stability, its first colors, its first whispers of life. And though it seemed mighty, though it felt eternal, its journey was only beginning. For no continent is ever fixed, no land is ever truly still. The Earth is a planet of motion, and the drift is eternal. Beneath the cratons, the mantle churned ceaselessly, carrying land upon its currents. The granite roots held firm, but they too floated, moved, and shifted across the planet's face. What seemed solid was always in motion, slower than tides, slower than rivers, but no less certain. Over millions of years, the first continent would break apart. Its fragments would scatter, carried into distant oceans. They would collide again, forming new lands, larger masses, different shapes. Mountains would rise and crumble, valleys would deepen and vanish, shorelines would shift endlessly, and yet in all of this change, the memory of the first continent would remain, its fragments woven into every new creation. Imagine watching the Earth from far above, not for moments or days, but for billions of years. The surface is alive, pieces of land gliding across the seas, colliding, joining, breaking, drifting once more. Supercontinents form, vast and mighty, only to fracture into wandering shards. The process never ends, a dance written into the planet's very being. The eternal drift. The oceans, too, follow this rhythm. They open and close, their basins reshaped by the moving land. Shorelines vanish, new coasts emerge. Rivers are redirected, mountains become islands, islands become mountains again. The seas do not resist the drift, they embrace it, flowing always into the spaces land leaves behind. Life itself rides upon this motion. The first microbes clung to Archean shorelines, but their descendants would one day sail upon the drifting continents, carried into every corner of the planet. Forests would grow where oceans once roared. Deserts would rise where rivers once flowed. Creatures would migrate across lands that had once been scattered fragments. All of it, the forests, the animals, the people, would owe their homes to the eternal drift of land across the mantle. At night, beneath the eternal stars, the drift is unseen, yet always present. The moon pulls at the seas, the mantle churns, the land inches forward. To stand upon stone is to stand upon something moving, something journeying, even if you cannot feel it. Every continent is a traveler, every shore a temporary boundary, every mountain a fleeting gesture in the slowest of dances. The first continent was the beginning, but it was also the pattern. It showed the Earth how to shape, how to move, how to endure through change. And from that moment on, the drift never stopped. It continues today, carrying Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, and Australia across the globe. It will continue tomorrow, splitting and rejoining, creating lands we cannot yet imagine. The eternal drift is not a cycle that ends. It is Earth's heartbeat, its endless journey, its way of breathing. And so the story of the first continent closes not with stillness, but with motion. It rose, it endured, it drifted, and its descendants still drift today. The land beneath our feet, no matter where we stand, is part of that journey, carried forward across billions of years. The continent may have been the first, but it was never the last, for Earth is a planet of drifting lands, and the drift is eternal.